All right, I'm Nicholas Bell from Ion Cinema, and we're here with Ira Sachs at the Sundance Film Festival 2012, where his latest film, Keep the Lights On, premiered several days ago.
Yeah.
First of all, as a gay critic, I would like to sincerely congratulate you on the film. I'm always very interested in, of course, seeing gay representation in cinema. And there isn't a whole lot else at the festival here to represent that kind of viewpoint this year, which makes it even more important, I think. But the nuance of the relationship is something that I think will be lost on a lot of kind of a heteronormative audience. But
I'm happy to say that having now shown the film had three screenings here, that's not been my experience in terms of the audience, because I think, someone asked me what is the difference between queer cinema from the 90s, of which I was also involved. I started making films in the mid-90s, and I made a film called The Delta in 97. And now, 20 years, 15 years later, what is the difference as a queer person, as a gay man, making a film? And I would say that this film is less about identity and more about relationships within certain communities, and that community is maybe not so marginalized as other times. Like my friends are very mixed in the world I live in, gay, straight, different races, different, there's a kind of merging of worlds. And I think this film I found that people have responded to it as individuals who have had experiences in relationships, whatever they might be. So I've had conversations with men who've just divorced their long-term wives, or a lesbian couple who came up today to talk about the film, and
Yeah, of course, I'm not saying there's not anything, there's a universal quality to it where I believe anybody that should watch it should be able to relate to the feelings these two.
But the facts are specific.
Yes.
That's where the facts are very specific.
And just watching it and having been around in 1998 when it begins, and the way, just such little details as the way gay men found sex and partners and over the phone, and how even that's changed. There's just, it feels like something that's really happened.
Right.
And I have read that there is an autobiographical aspect.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say one last thing about that, which is I think we're really, I'll watch any number of things, reality television, particularly on television, because I'm really happy to see little bits of my own life on screen. And the fact that I'll watch some pretty bad reality TV, if there's gay people on it, just shows that I'm just happy to see people who look like me.
Yeah, you're looking to see, representations of you and what that's like.
Yeah, exactly. The film does have an autobiographical history. It's not an autobiography. It's very much a fictional film with a certain kind of personal background, is what I would say. I was in a relationship for 10 years that ended in 2007, and pretty much soon after it ended, I realized that there was a last day of that relationship, and I was very aware that there was a first day of that relationship, and that somehow in between there was a really good story.
Okay.
And I was, as a filmmaker, you're really happy to know the logline in some way, because then you feel like you can make digressions, and but you always will have a sense of how the thing needs to propel itself forward and where it was going. And I always knew this film was going to begin with the two men meeting and end with them parting. And I think that trajectory is what holds the audience's interest.
Okay. So 2007 was when Married Life came out.
Yeah.
So about how long after did you seriously start taking this on as your next film project?
I guess in 2008, I went to the Yaddo Artist Residency, and I spent 3 weeks going through notebooks and letters and journals and hundreds of pages of material that I had accumulated over 10 years very personally. And I started to write a chronology that in a way looked like diaries, because it looked like, and that's in a way how the film looks. It looks like little pieces of life with ellipses in between. So we had everything. I then put it away for a couple of years. And I brought it back out when I discussed it with a co-writer, Mauricio Zacharias, who I was working with, and we were working on another project, and right before we kind of got deep into that, I said, oh, just read this, just look at this. And he did, and he called me a couple of days later. It took him a couple of days to read. There was a lot of material. And he said, this is the story. This is a great story, and we should do this. So we then were in a process for about 6 more months of trying to craft 10 years of experience into one feature film. And that was about a 6-month process.
Okay. I noticed that you, in at least 3 of your films, I've seen all of them, but yeah, they're all very good. You kind of compound a foreign presence. It's more than I've seen. There's white and black people, but there's something extra. In the Delta, there's a Vietnamese half-black character. In 40 Shades of Blue, you have a Russian woman in Tennessee.
Right.
And in this film, Keep the Lights On, you have a Danish lead character.
Right.
Can you talk about what you're interested in is in kind of bringing yet another element that you don't see a lot of?
Well, I would say it began. There are 2 different reasons. On a sort of thematic reason, I'm interested in various forms of outsiders, and as a gay man, as a Jewish man who grew up in the South, as an artist, any number of ways I think I felt slightly outside and slightly inside. Like I'm also a white guy, who has a lot of privilege and part of a mainstream and part of a sort of dominant culture in a lot of ways. So I'm interested in the sort of the questions between dominance and in position and marginalized, because I experience both, because I'm definitely both in different ways. So there's a way in which the thematically the foreigner is a really good sort of mixture of all these different questions. Then there's something that's more specific, which is I think I have an affection and I'm drawn to a non-American kind of acting style that you often find in foreign performers. Isabelle Huppert is one of my favorite actresses in the world, and I think she's a very good example of a non-American style of acting, and an acting which is defined by the details and the moments and the reactions to things that are happening right in front of you, instead of necessarily defined by the plot. Plot exists clearly in non-American films, but the moments also have a certain kind of authority that you, and so I get these actors, both Dina Korzun, who's the star of 40 Shades of Blue, and Thure Lindhardt, who's the star of Keep the Lights On. There's something really just infinite about the way things are going on in their minds that you can see as an audience when you're watching their performances. They're fast. Things are going on. And I think that texture is something that I'm really drawn to.
Okay.
Also, with this film, Keep the Lights On is a really sexual film, and there's a lot of nudity, and there's a lot of exposure in a certain way, emotional and physical. And it was not easy to find an American actor who I thought was right for the part, good enough for the part, who would do it. And then, and so it was a natural extension to go look farther.
Okay. Did you know, even at the script stage, that you were looking for Danish?
Never.
No. Okay.
I really wasn't. The thing is, I've now, because of 40 Shades of Blue specifically, and a feeling where that succeeded. That part originally was written as a white, blonde American woman. The first woman who was cast in the film was Julianne Moore. Then Maggie Chung was cast in the film, and then Dina Korzun. And so there was this process. But for example, in that film, I never would have cast a French woman in the film because it wouldn't have made sense to the dynamic, the economic dynamic of that story. And I think similarly with Keep the Lights On, I found the best actor for the role. He was Danish, but I needed someone who would fit in the other elements of the film, and he would. He doesn't seem foreign to his position in the culture, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And then you were also able to bring back Paprika Steen.
Oh, yes.
So you must enjoy working with her.
I think she's one of the greatest actresses working today. I loved working with her in 40 Shades of Blue, and then I saw her in Toronto a couple of years ago in a film called Applause. And I was just like, she's the best. When I ended up casting Thure Lindhardt as the lead, I suddenly realized that I had the opportunity to call Paprika and say, "Would you get on a plane and come work for nothing for a few days in New York?" And she
of course she did.
She kindly did, and that was really great. They knew each other because they're both big stars in Denmark. We were going to have T-shirts for Keep the Lights On, which said "I'm big in Denmark." That's what their actors are.
They are, yeah.
And they'd never worked together, so it was really great to see them do that.
Yeah, it's very eye-catching to see her names pop up in the credits of an American film.
Right.
So the lead character Eric, he's a documentary filmmaker,
Right.
And he's choosing to recuperate this gay history that's kind of been forgotten. Do you see? So in a way, you're kind of doing the same thing he's doing. Is you're recuperating a certain time and place that is still kind of not as marginalized. Gay people aren't as marginalized today. Our history on screen, perhaps, is.
Well, it's sort of what James Bidgood is in the film, and he was the filmmaker who made Pink Narcissus, which I don't know if you've ever seen.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard
I really
it.
recommend it. It's a wonderful film that he made very privately in his own home for about 7 years, and it came out. He made it in the late 60s, early 70s, and it came out in the 90s, and it's just extraordinary and individual work of mad genius, I would say. And he says within the film, because he's the character that they interview,
okay.
that Eric interviews, and he says, "We weren't making great things, we were just making things that other people were not." And I think this film is similar.
It's like that.
It's films that other people were not. I also think, for me, I'm interested in, and almost on an anthropological level, how over a course of let's just say 70 years, culture changes, and specifically the subculture of gay life in New York. So you have this figure of Avery Willard, who was a real man who made films in the 70s and 80s, and underground films that were kind of completely lost. And he was also putting out a magazine called Gay Zine, and how I'm from the generation, I would say, days after Stonewall. I came out in 78. So, or I guess I started having sex in 78. I came out in maybe 80, But we're talking about minutes after Stonewall. So
yeah.
I'm basically, you could say I'm a pre-Stonewall person, because the culture that I was coming out to was not a post-Stonewall culture. It was Memphis, Tennessee in the 70s. So I think that the influence of that history upon my life in my generation and my generation's relationships is really interesting to me. How have our relationships been formed, affected, and in some ways challenged in very deep ways by that legacy? So we're all part of some continuum historically, and I think the film tries to address that.
It does, and I thought it was refreshing that it's also, of course, not circulating around HIV/AIDS, as many gay films still do. But I'm curious about, you pass over 9/11.
Right.
And was that a conscious decision?
I have to be honest. 9/11 was a hugely transformative moment in my culture and our country, but it did not have a significant impact upon my relationship, and I think that's just the way history is. That's just the way history sometimes works. It was not a crux point for shifts in the bonds between those two individuals. So I think that's why it didn't enter into the story. It also is a very it's a very difficult thing to bring in loosely.
I agree.
And I really tried not to talk about anything that happened in a way in history, except through how it influenced the relationship. So HIV and AIDS is very crucial early in the film, and there's a characters that are referred to, and how it seeps into the relationship, but
it doesn't inform it.
It doesn't. It is not the pronounced informative event.
And I didn't actually even think of 9/11 at all watching it. I think it was something I happened to read about afterwards,
Right.
because it just isn't integral. So I'm happy to see that it wasn't in there. But since the Delta, which you made in '96.
I made in '96. I shot it in '95. It was in Toronto in '96. It was at Sundance in January of '97.
And you've had a couple films in between there and this, and this you're returning to. You have gay characters.
Right.
I saw a lot of self-loathing in the Delta, in the characters.
Right.
Of course, you have a closeted white man, and then a mixed person that hates part of what he is.
Right.
And I don't see any of that, really, in Keep the Lights On. Do you think the difference in how we are able to bring gay stories to the screen has anything to do with that?
It's interesting you don't see it. I think I had it. I think Thure has less of it as an actor than I do. So I think that in a way Eric is a very is a much more positive figure than maybe than I certainly was at the time. But I think there is a sense in which I think there's a lot of self-loathing in someone who decides to stay in a relationship, which is on one level full of a sort of kind of masochistic pain. And I think there is a lot of there's a lack of knowledge about what other possibilities are.
True, I think, and it's so hard to make connections amongst gay men in such a hypersexualized setting that I think it completely makes sense to me that he would have clung to him, because he doesn't know if he'd ever find that connection again, and it's worth.
You put it well.
It's worth staying for the time he stays.
Yeah. But I also think that there's something very specific about the kind of person who, early in a relationship, the person you're dating pulls out a crack pipe, and then you decide to live together for the next 10 years. Like, that's not everybody.
No.
And I think
certainly.
that's something that I wouldn't repeat personally.
And I think that something that's a perfectly realized scene in the film is when his best friend, Julianne Nicholson,
Correct.
Is angry at him for not saying earlier what happened. And I think that with our straight heterosexual friends, we're afraid to admit when there's problems within our relationships, because it means it's a failure or it's not working.
Unfortunately, I don't just think it's for gay people who have this
True,
issue.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
There's a lot of, but I think it is specific for gay people on some level. But I think in general that many of us want to look like one thing, and our experience in life looks like something different. The title of the film is very specifically "Keep the Lights On," because in a way I'm trying to say, look and be open about the behavior that you do, and don't shy away from its reality, whatever it might be. You're going to learn from keeping the lights on that behavior. And as a community, I think we also can, to an extent that I hope this film creates opportunities for people to actually say, what do we think about monogamy? What do we think about non-monogamy? What do we think about drugs? What do we think about sex? How are these things influencing our relationships? How can we talk about these things without trying to pathologize them? That's certainly not my intention. But they're elements within our lives, and how are they affecting us?
I agree. So what are there any films in particular that influenced you?
Yes, very much so. I tend to work through and closely with other films. Every film that I've made, I could tell you, like, there was a certain film or a certain set of films that were the key films for those works. So with 40 Shades of Blue, for example, it was 3 films by Ken Loach, a film called Kes, Looks and Smiles, and Family Life.
Okay.
These were 3 films made by Ken Loach in the late 70s and early 80s, and they were our guiding post visually. With Keep the Lights On, it began in a way with a film called Before I Forget, which is a film by Jacques Millot. Yeah, and Jacques Millot stars in the film, and it's clearly autobiographically based, and he plays a man who's looking back on his life in a particular class culture and as a gay man in Paris at a certain time. And I watched that film and I thought, how come there's no films that look like my life in New York City, not in the past, now? I don't see a lot of films that look like the way that I live, so I wanted to make a film like that. A film called A Bigger Splash by Jack Hazen, which is a documentary, highly recommend, about David Hockney, that was made in the early 70s. And it moves through time in a very similar way to our film. It's also a portrait film, and I think this is very much a portrait film. And then I would say, in terms of the shooting of the film, the biggest influence for Thimios Bakatakis, my wonderful cinematographer, and I, were the films of Maurice Leclerc, who is a French realist. He is I think of him as the Cassavetes of France, not because his work looks like Cassavetes, but because he was the biggest influence on contemporary French cinema.
Okay. Under the Son of Satan.
Well, the Under the Son of Satan won Cannes one year, but the films that we were looking at were a film called Lulu, with Isabelle and Isabelle, a film called We Won't Grow Old Together, his first film, which is called Naked Childhood, L'Enfance Nue, and the other film was A Nos Amours, which was Sandrine Bonnier's first film. Those four films...
With Klaus Nomi.
With Klaus Nomi in the soundtrack, in the opening soundtrack. Those four films really gave us the guide of how to shoot Keep the Lights On.
I guess in closing, I was trying to look up the soundtrack. I couldn't find a listing.
Oh,
but
well, it will be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the selections?
Well, the score of the film is all the music of Arthur Russell.
Okay.
Arthur Russell was a musician who died in '92 in New York of AIDS, and there was a documentary made about Arthur's life called Wild Combination by a wonderful filmmaker named Matt Wolfe, and the documentary is fantastic, and it kind of changed my life. I ended up making a film called Last Address, seeing this documentary about Arthur and thinking about a whole generation of men who died in New York during that generation of the most affected by AIDS. But Arthur's music, he made a huge, like a room full of music that most people never heard. And in the mid-90s, there was a man named Steve Knutson who found this material, and he started releasing it on albums. This was after Arthur's death. Okay. We are using the archive of Arthur's music to create the score for Keep the Lights On. So it's all Arthur's music, and it has a very particular tone and character. A lot of cello, there's a sort of depth, there's an originality, there's lyrics. It's very complex music, which somehow fit really well as a character. I'm actually working on my next film is based on the relationship Arthur had with his widower, Tom Lee, and they had a very beautiful romance that somehow, against the adversity of illness, against the adversity of making work that no one wanted to hear, they somehow created something very beautiful together, both their relationship and the music that existed.
That's excellent. I was because you tend to take a few years in between projects. So
life's too short at this point.
That's awesome.
We're speeding up.
Awesome. That's good. Good to hear.
So January 2013, we're going to go into pre-production.
Okay. Wow.
You're hearing it here first.
Awesome. That's awesome.
It's not written. There's no money, but it's going to happen.
It's going to happen. Well, you can make it happen.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for meeting with me.
Thanks so much.